Hold it right there! Officer Reed's voice boomed across the street as he slammed his foot on the brakes, bringing his patrol car to a screeching halt right in front of Mariah. The sun was low over the East Side neighborhood, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks, the kind that made the area look tired, worn, and forgotten. Mariah had just returned home after her long deployment, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder as she walked through the familiar streets. The air was thick with the smells of fried food, gasoline, and the buzz of idle chatter from the nearby shops, a far cry from the war zones she had just left behind. But there was a certain calm in being back home, even though it felt strange, familiar, yet foreign. She didn't need to look at the patrol car to know why it had stopped. It was no coincidence. It never was when she walked through these streets. As she turned slightly, she saw Officer Reed's face, a scowl on his features, his eyes scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Excuse me, miss," he called, leaning out of the car window with a casual arrogance. "What are you doing around here?" Mariah didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm, unreadable. She had seen men like Reed before, men who mistook confidence for arrogance, who saw a black woman walking in their neighborhood and assumed she didn't belong. Her posture didn't change, the weight of her military training keeping her grounded. She had learned long ago to not give in to their intimidation, and she wasn't about to start now. "I'm just walking," she said, her voice even, her gaze never wavering from his. "Didn't know I needed permission to walk down my own street." Reed's eyes flickered with irritation. He didn't like her response. His hand gripped the steering wheel tighter, and his posture straightened, as if preparing for an argument he thought was coming. Mariah could already tell where this was headed. It wasn't about a simple question. It never was when you looked like her and walked with the confidence of someone who had seen and survived things Reed would never even imagine. "Got a lot of break-ins around here recently," he said, his voice thick with suspicion. "We've got to make sure everything's in order." Mariah held his gaze, unfazed by his thinly veiled accusation. "You see me breaking into anything?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled. His jaw twitched, as if her words had struck a nerve. He didn't like being questioned, and he didn't like being called out. His smirk faded slightly, but he refused to back down. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he said, the last word dripping with condescension, as if she should be grateful he was even speaking to her. Mariah could feel the shift in the air. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was trying to assert control over her, and that was something she wasn't about to let happen. "You're doing your job?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I don't recall doing anything wrong. I'm just walking. Nothing suspicious about that." She stood still, waiting for him to say something else, to push her further, but he hesitated for just a moment. His gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, and his posture shifted. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been when he first stopped her, but that wasn't enough to make him back down. "You're not going to tell me what you're doing in this neighborhood?" he asked again, his voice growing more forceful, less patient than before. "Just some woman wandering around?" Mariah didn't let the challenge ruffle her. She had encountered men like him before, police officers, security guards, strangers in her own neighborhood, who saw her as nothing more than a target, someone to control. They didn't understand her, didn't respect her, and they certainly didn't expect her to stand her ground. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I don't need to tell you where I'm going. You've got no right to ask." Reed's face hardened. "I'm asking you for your ID," he snapped, his tone now more commanding, more threatening. "Now." Mariah felt the tension in the air thicken, but she didn't budge. She didn't move. She had been trained for moments like this. Her military training, her years of dealing with situations much worse than this, had taught her restraint, the need to assess, to control the situation before it could escalate. And she could feel it escalating. Reed was getting frustrated, and that frustration was starting to bleed through in his movements. No, she said simply, her voice cutting through the space between them. I'm not handing over my ID unless you tell me exactly why you stopped me. Reed didn't like being defied. His nostrils flared as he leaned forward, his jaw clenched. Mariah could feel the heat of his gaze now, his irritation simmering just beneath the surface. I'm asking you for your ID because I can, he said, his voice rising. Now do as you're told. Mariah didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not now, not in her own neighborhood. Her father had taught her long ago to pick her battles. But this wasn't just about picking a fight. This was about standing her ground, about not letting herself be pushed around by someone who thought their badge gave them power over her. You're not asking, you're demanding, Mariah said, her voice steady and unyielding. And I don't have to give you anything unless you have a reason. I've done nothing wrong. Reed's fingers twitched on the steering wheel, and Mariah saw his thumb move toward the latch of his holster. It was a subtle move, but it didn't go unnoticed. He was making a threat, trying to intimidate her, but Mariah wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to let him escalate this any further. She reached into her pocket slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and controlled, and pulled out her military ID. She held it up for him to see, not handing it to him, but just showing him the proof he wanted. Reed's gaze flicked over the ID, his eyes narrowing as he read it. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, like he was trying to process the fact that this woman wasn't just some civilian walking down the street. She was a trained soldier, a veteran, someone who had seen more than he ever would. His lips curled into a smirk, but it wasn't genuine. Navy SEALs, huh? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's cute. Mariah's hand tightened around the strap of her duffel bag, but she didn't move. Give it back, she said, her voice cold, controlled. Now. Reed didn't hand it back right away. Instead, he flipped the ID over between his fingers, still trying to assert some sort of control over the situation. You really expect me to believe this? A woman like you in the SEALs? He sneered. You sure that's not a fake? The insult hit its mark. It wasn't just a challenge to her identity. It was a challenge to everything she had fought for, everything she had worked for. But Mariah didn't let it show. She had heard worse. She had been through worse. You can run it through your system if you want, she said flatly, but you'll find out soon enough. She saw Reed's jaw tighten. His smirk wavered for a moment, and in that instant, she knew she had him. He wasn't in control anymore. The crowd that had gathered, the people with their phones raised, were watching him now, not her. The power had shifted, and he was starting to feel it. You're gonna regret this, he said, his voice low with frustration. I don't like being made a fool of. Mariah didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She just stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle. And when he finally realized that he wasn't going to win this, he did something unexpected. He reached for her wrist. That was the last mistake he made. The moment Officer Reed grabbed Mariah's wrist, everything seemed to freeze. The sudden force made her muscles tense, but her mind remained clear. She could feel his hand gripping her with authority, but there was a slight tremor in his fingers, as if he wasn't entirely sure of himself anymore. Mariah didn't fight back physically, but the defiance in her eyes was enough to make him hesitate. His mistake was underestimating her, thinking she was just another woman to push around. Don't touch me, Mariah said slowly, her voice calm but laced with warning. You have no right. Officer Reed didn't release his grip. Instead, his face twisted into something darker, a mix of rage and arrogance. He was losing control, and he didn't like it. He had expected her to comply, expected her to shrink under the weight of his uniform and his badge. But instead, she stood firm. That wasn't something he knew how to handle. You're resisting arrest, he spat, his words sharp, his tone now dripping with venom. I'm not playing games with you, lady. Mariah barely flinched. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. This was his tactic, to provoke her, to make her react in a way that would justify his actions. But Mariah wasn't like the others he had encountered. She wasn't afraid of his authority, and she wasn't going to let him manipulate her. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You've got no cause to arrest me." Reed's grip tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he snarled. The words were meant to provoke, to break her down, but instead, they revealed his own frustration. Mariah could see it in his eyes now, the cracks in his confident demeanor. The shift in power had begun, and he wasn't ready for it. He started pulling her toward the patrol car, his rough handling growing more aggressive with each step. Mariah didn't resist physically, but her body language spoke volumes. She refused to let him break her. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, watching, waiting for something to happen. Some had already started pulling out their phones, recording the encounter. The last thing Officer Reed wanted was to become the center of attention, but that's exactly what was happening. One of the bystanders spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her tone confused, almost pleading. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Reed shot her a venomous look, the anger radiating from him. "Stay out of this!" he barked, his voice a sharp command, as though the woman had no right to question him. He was the authority here, and he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by civilians who thought they knew better. Mariah could feel the heat of his glare, but she remained calm, composed. She wasn't the one who was in the wrong, and she wasn't going to let him make her feel like she was. She knew her rights, and more importantly, she knew how to navigate a situation like this. She had been trained to handle hostile situations, to stay focused when everything around her was falling apart. This was no different. "Let me go," Mariah said, her voice low but firm. "I don't want to make this worse for you." Reed's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he jerked her arm forward, trying to force her into the car. The harder he pulled, the more Mariah refused to give in. She didn't fight back physically. She didn't need to. Her body stayed steady, planted, like a rock against a crashing wave. She knew that any resistance from her would be used against her, but she didn't need to move to show him that she wasn't going to back down. Reed let out an exasperated sigh, frustrated by her refusal to cooperate. He had expected this to be an easy arrest. He had assumed she would buckle under pressure, as most people did when faced with the overwhelming force of the police. But Mariah was no ordinary person. She wasn't intimidated by his badge or his uniform. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" Reed spat, his voice filled with a mix of irritation and something darker. "Just because you're in the military doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You don't get to walk around here like you own the place." Mariah's gaze never wavered. "I'm not above the law," she said evenly, "but neither are you." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Reed hesitated. He was used to throwing his weight around, used to people cowering in fear when he spoke. But Mariah wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of his badge or his threats. She had seen much worse, faced much more dangerous situations, and she wasn't about to let some small-town cop push her around. The tension between them thickened, the crowd around them growing in size. More people began speaking up, voicing their objections, challenging Reed's authority. The shift was unmistakable. Reed's grip on the situation was slipping, and he knew it. His face was turning red with frustration, his breathing heavier, and the anger he was trying so hard to control was starting to bubble to the surface. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Reed snapped, his tone now filled with malice. "I don't care who you are. You don't get to disrespect me." Mariah stood tall, her back straight, her jaw set with determination. "I'm not disrespecting you," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "I'm standing up for myself. Something you clearly don't understand." He didn't like that. The words cut deeper than he expected, and for a brief moment, Reed's confidence faltered. But he quickly masked it with anger, trying to regain control. "You're resisting arrest, and I'm going to make sure you learn your place." But Mariah was already one step ahead. She didn't need to say anything more. She didn't need to physically resist him. All she had to do was stand there, unflinching, unafraid. The crowd was watching now. The situation was shifting. Officer Reed's attempts to assert his power were backfiring, and it was becoming painfully clear to everyone around that he was the one who had lost control. He stepped forward again, his hands reaching for her once more, but this time Mariah was ready. She sidestepped him effortlessly, her movements fluid and precise, a calculated move that left him stumbling forward, off balance. He flailed, his face contorted with frustration as he tried to regain his footing. For a split second, his grip loosened on her arm. The crowd gasped. Some started clapping, others jeering. Mariah could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't look away. She stayed focused, her posture still straight, her expression unreadable. She had won this moment, and she knew it. Reed, now visibly flustered, took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. The crowd had turned on him. The power dynamics had shifted completely, and it was clear to everyone who was in control now. He fumbled for his radio, calling for backup, but it was too late. Mariah had already won. The crowd's support had tipped the scale, and there was no going back for Reed now. "Take a step back, officer," a voice from the crowd called out, sharp and accusing. "You've already lost this one." Reed, his chest heaving with frustration, didn't respond. He couldn't. His power, his authority, was crumbling in front of him. And Mariah? She stood there unfazed, knowing that this was only the beginning of the shift in power that needed to happen. This was her victory, and she wasn't done yet. Officer Reed was not accustomed to being questioned. He had spent years wearing his badge with an arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. But Mariah wasn't like the others. She wasn't a person who was easily intimidated or bent to his will. She wasn't just some woman to push around, and she was making that abundantly clear. Still, Reed wasn't about to admit defeat. His grip on his authority was slipping, but he wasn't about to let it go without a fight. He stood there, red-faced and seething with anger, unwilling to let her win. "Don't make me call for backup," he growled, his voice rising with frustration. "You're not going to talk to me like that. You think just because you've got a military ID you can do whatever you want? You think you're special?" Mariah didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to provoke her, trying to get a reaction out of her. He wanted to feel in control again, to reassert himself as the one in charge. But Mariah wasn't going to play his game. "I didn't come here to argue with you, Reed," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "I came here to walk in my own neighborhood. You stopped me for no reason, and I'm not going to let you escalate this." His eyes narrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Reed wasn't used to people talking to him like this, especially not a woman, especially not a black woman. He had already decided that she didn't belong here, that she was somehow out of place, and he was doing everything in his power to make her feel small. But it wasn't working. He could feel the shift in the air as the crowd began to gather, watching the interaction unfold. The attention was not on him anymore. It was on her. "You think you can talk down to me like you're my superior?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're in my jurisdiction, lady. You don't get to dictate what happens here." Mariah's eyes hardened. "I'm not here to fight with you, Reed. I'm here to walk. But if you want to make this a fight, we can do that too." Her words hit Reed like a punch to the gut. He wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not like this. His face reddened further, and he felt the anger surge within him, clouding his judgment. He didn't care about protocol or procedure anymore. He was caught up in the need to assert himself, to remind her and everyone watching that he was in charge. "Just do what I say, and we'll make this easy," Reed barked, his voice now laced with hostility. He took another step toward her, his hand outstretched, trying to grab her arm again, but Mariah was ready. In one swift motion, she sidestepped him, using his forward momentum against him. She didn't have to fight him physically. She didn't need to. She just had to stay calm, stay in control. Her body moved fluidly, like she had done thousands of times before in more dangerous situations. She wasn't going to let him touch her. She wasn't going to let him drag her into his power struggle. Reed stumbled, his body thrown off balance by her swift move. His eyes widened, and for a split second, he was completely vulnerable. He hadn't expected her to be so quick, so composed, and the fact that she had evaded him made him even more furious. His face twisted in a snarl, his hand reaching for his radio. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice rising. "I'll have you locked up for resisting. You think you're too good for this, huh? Think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" Mariah stood her ground, her gaze unyielding, her expression calm. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The crowd was watching now, some pulling out their phones, recording every second of the encounter. She knew that whatever happened next would be documented. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced by men like him. "Do I look like I'm resisting, Reed?" she asked coldly. "You're the one escalating this." "I haven't done anything wrong." Reed's fingers clenched around the radio, his knuckles white. He was losing control, and it was humiliating. He could feel his pride slipping away, piece by piece, as the crowd began murmuring, their voices growing louder in support of Mariah. She wasn't just standing her ground, she was making him look weak. "You really want to play this game?" Reed spat, his anger bubbling over. "You think people are going to stand up for you, huh? You think they care about some woman walking around here thinking she's above the law?" Mariah didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The truth was written in her posture, in the way she stood there unflinching, unafraid. She wasn't just another person to be pushed around by Reed. She was someone who had fought in wars, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and had come out the other side stronger for it. She had fought for her country, for justice, for freedom. And she wasn't about to let some small-town cop take that from her. The crowd began to speak out louder now, their voices rising in protest. "He's the one who's out of line," someone shouted. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Another voice added, "Let her go, man. You're just harassing her." Reed's face turned crimson as the realization set in. The tide was turning. The power he had always held over situations like this was slipping through his fingers. He was no longer in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. The crowd was with Mariah now. They could see through his false authority, and they weren't afraid to stand up to him. The more the crowd spoke up, the more desperate Reed became. "Shut up," he yelled at the crowd, his voice cracking. "Get back inside. You don't know what you're talking about." But it was too late. The crowd wasn't backing down, and neither was Mariah. She had already won. Not in the legal sense, not yet, but in the sense that she had taken control of the situation. She had made Reed lose his composure. She had made him look like the fool. She had exposed his abuse of power for everyone to see. Reed's hand hovered over his holster, but before he could make another move, he was interrupted. A deep voice rang out from behind him. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Sergeant William Burke, an older officer with a calm demeanor and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward, his gaze flicking between Mariah and Reed. Reed's posture stiffened, and he straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of control. "There's no problem," Reed muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just being difficult." Burke raised an eyebrow. "Difficult, huh?" His voice was cool, but firm. "You've got backup on the way. You sure about that?" Reed opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no excuse left. He had no way to justify his actions. The crowd had seen through him. Mariah had seen through him. And Burke? He could see it all too clearly. Mariah stood silently, watching Reed's embarrassment unfold. She knew what was coming next. Burke would handle this. He was a seasoned officer, and he knew how to handle officers like Reed. The way Reed had treated her was not just a bad move. It was a mistake, one that would follow him long after this encounter ended. "You're done, Reed," Burke said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Go back to your car. I'll handle it from here. Reed, humiliated and defeated, said nothing. He turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car without another word. The crowd watched him go, some of them muttering under their breath, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Mariah didn't look at him as he walked away. She didn't need to. She had already won. As Burke turned to her, his expression softened. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mariah nodded, the slightest of smiles touching her lips. "I am now." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmurs of approval echoing in the background. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, but it wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Officer Reed. It was about something bigger. Something that had been building for a long time. Something that had finally started to change. And Mariah? She walked away with her head held high. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority, and she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Reed's anger was starting to boil over. The crowd had turned on him, and every second that passed only made it worse. He was the one who was supposed to be in control, but here he was, his authority slipping, his power fading, and the woman who had made him look like a fool standing there, unshaken and proud. He could feel his heart racing, his pulse quickening as his frustrations mounted. The crowd's jeering only seemed to amplify his irritation, a reminder that he had completely lost the situation. The moment Burke, his superior, stepped in, Reed's grip on the situation was fully gone. He couldn't even look the man in the eye. Sergeant Burke was a professional, someone who had seen it all, and Reed knew that the older officer wasn't going to tolerate his outburst, especially not in front of a crowd. Burke wasn't one to coddle him, but he didn't have to say much for Reed to realize that his conduct had been unacceptable. "Reed." Burke's voice cut through the noise, and Reed flinched as if the word itself stung. "What the hell is going on here?" Reed's tongue felt thick in his mouth, and for a moment he could barely get the words out. I was just trying to do my job, Sergeant," Reed muttered, his voice faltering. He glanced back at Mariah, who was still standing tall, her presence unwavering despite the tension that had been building. Burke didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Reed, his face a mixture of disappointment and incredulity. He could see through Reed's excuse, knew it for what it was, a weak attempt at salvaging his pride. Burke had known Reed long enough to recognize when his officer was losing control, and this was one of those moments. "You think she was resisting arrest?" Burke's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Or do you think you were just trying to intimidate her?" Reed's face flushed, but he refused to back down. "She wasn't being cooperative," he shot back, his words biting. She wouldn't show me her ID when I asked. That's all I was asking for." Burke let out a sharp sigh, clearly irritated. "You've got a civilian standing here doing nothing wrong, and you escalate the situation like that?" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to make someone feel like that just because you don't like the way they look, or because they don't bow down to you." Reed opened his mouth to argue, but Burke's stare silenced him. It was a look that spoke volumes, a look that told Reed he was done talking, done making excuses. It was the same look Burke gave to anyone who had been caught in the wrong, and Reed felt a pit in his stomach grow with every passing second. Burke turned back to Mariah, his face softening slightly. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his tone respectful, professional. Mariah nodded. "I'm fine, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady. "I've dealt with worse." She wasn't lying. She had faced much worse situations, dangerous ones, life-threatening ones. But this was different. This was a battle of control, a battle of power, and she had stood her ground. And in doing so, she had exposed Reed for what he truly was, a man who relied on his badge to intimidate, to oppress, to feel powerful. The shame she felt earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of vindication. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by someone like Reed. Burke turned back to Reed, his patience thinning. You know what, Reed? I think you need to go back to your car. We're done here. Reed's eyes widened, and his breath caught. Sergeant, Go! Burke interrupted, his voice sharp now. You've lost control of this situation, and I'm not letting it escalate any further. You've done enough damage. Reed stood frozen for a moment, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His pride was bruised, his authority shattered, but he knew there was no point in arguing. The weight of the situation finally hit him, and he realized that his attempt to flex his power had only made him look weak. He turned slowly, walking toward his patrol car, his shoulders slumped. The crowd, once tense with uncertainty, was now filled with murmurs of approval. Some even started to clap. Mariah's gaze didn't leave Reed as he walked away. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she didn't care. This moment, this victory, was hers. She had fought back. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. She had made Reed look weak, made him realize he was no longer the one with the power. The shift had happened, and he had no idea what to do with it. Burke watched Reed walk away, his expression unreadable. He had seen this happen before, too many times to count, and it never failed to frustrate him. Officers who were too eager to assert their power, too quick to escalate situations without understanding the full picture. But Burke wasn't interested in making Reed an example. He just wanted this to end, and he knew that the sooner Reed was out of the picture, the sooner they could move on. Burke turned back to Mariah, giving her a quick nod of respect. Thanks for handling that, he said quietly. You did well. Mariah shook her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. I didn't do anything, she said, though the pride in her voice was hard to miss. I just stood my ground. You've got guts, I'll give you that, Burke said with a small, approving smile. You knew exactly how to handle him. Mariah didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The crowd was dispersing, their murmurs dying down, but she could feel the eyes of a few people still on her. They had witnessed something important today. They had seen someone stand up, not just for herself, but for what was right. And that, in itself, was enough to inspire change. As she turned to walk away, she heard one last voice from the crowd. You made him look like a fool, someone called out, and the words felt like a small victory for all of them. Mariah glanced back at the group, a brief smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She had made a difference today, even if it was just a small one. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance could cause the greatest change. The road ahead would be long, but as she walked away from the scene, she knew that this moment, this victory, was just the beginning. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. Reed had always believed that his badge gave him the power to control any situation. But as he sat in his patrol car, staring out through the windshield with clenched fists, he couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, something deep, something permanent. He had been humiliated, and worse, he had lost control. He could feel it gnawing at him, eating away at his pride with every passing second. The crowd had turned on him. Mariah had turned the tide, and no amount of arrogance or threats was going to erase that. He slammed the car door shut and stormed into the precinct, his boots clicking sharply on the cold concrete floor. His mind was spinning with anger, frustration, and a growing sense of defeat. But the worst part? The thing that kept him awake at night? The thought that kept circling his brain like a vulture was the fact that, in front of everyone, Mariah had made him look weak. The precinct was quiet, the usual bustle of officers and clerks muted as Reed made his way through the hallway. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him as he passed, but no one spoke. No one dared to offer a word of comfort or support. He was on his own, and he knew it. As he entered his superior's office, Sergeant Anderson barely looked up from his desk. You're here. Let's get this over with. Reed stood stiffly, trying to hold on to whatever semblance of authority he had left. It's not what you think, Sergeant, she resisted. I was just doing my job. I had to arrest her. Anderson put down his pen, finally looking up at Reed with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "You think she resisted?" Anderson asked coldly. "You think she did something wrong? I saw the video, Reed. You're lucky it didn't escalate further. You're lucky we don't have a lawsuit on our hands." Reed's blood began to boil. "She was disrespecting me," he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "She stood there like she was better than me, like she didn't have to answer to me. You didn't see the way she looked at me, Sergeant? She thinks she's above the law." Anderson's eyes narrowed, his face hardening as he leaned back in his chair. "No, Reed," he said slowly, his tone almost clinical. "She didn't disrespect you. You disrespected her. You overstepped your authority, and you've been caught. You think anyone's going to back you up after that display? Everyone in this department knows you've been on a power trip lately. That's why you're here, getting chewed out by me instead of patrolling the streets." Reed clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The shame was overwhelming, but he couldn't let it show. He had always been the one in control. He had always been the one people feared, the one who commanded respect. But now, he was just a failure. The image of Mariah standing tall, unwavering, watching him lose his cool in front of a crowd, it was burned into his mind. The humiliation was unbearable. "You think I don't know that?" Reed growled. "You think I don't know I messed up? But she was a challenge. She had no respect for me. She thought she could just walk around without consequences." Anderson shook his head, his expression hardened. "You let your pride get in the way, Reed. This isn't about her disrespecting you. This is about you losing control, about you abusing your power. Do you really think anyone's going to sympathize with you when they see that video? You acted like a bully, Reed. And now, you're paying the price." The words stung, each one landing like a slap to Reed's ego. He couldn't handle it anymore. He couldn't bear the thought of being seen as weak, as someone who couldn't control a simple situation. He had been a cop for too long to be brought down by one woman, no matter how tough she seemed. "What's going to happen now?" Reed asked, his voice quieter, filled with a mixture of dread and anger. Anderson sighed, his gaze never leaving Reed's face. "You're on suspension for the time being. We'll figure out what to do next. If the department decides to push forward with the investigation, there's a good chance you'll be on the receiving end of a lawsuit. And if that happens, don't expect any backup from me." Reed's heart sank as the gravity of the situation hit him. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on being the one who enforced the rules. But now, he was the one who was being punished. He was the one who had crossed the line. Meanwhile, Mariah had no intention of letting the matter drop. The encounter with Reed had left a bitter taste in her mouth, but it had also ignited something inside her, a fierce determination to not let the situation fade into nothing. She had witnessed firsthand how easily people like Reed could manipulate their authority to push others down, to intimidate and control. And she wasn't going to let him get away with it, not after everything she had been through. She spent the next few days gathering information, speaking with people who had witnessed the encounter, collecting the footage from the bystanders who had recorded the entire incident. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that Reed and officers like him were held accountable for their actions. Mariah knew that if she didn't do something, if she didn't use her voice, nothing would change. She reached out to a lawyer she trusted, someone who had worked on civil rights cases before. "I'm ready to go public with this," Mariah said when they spoke on the phone. "I'm not going to let them bury this. Reed needs to be held accountable." The lawyer's voice was calm, understanding. "I hear you, Mariah. We'll make sure you're heard, but you need to be prepared for what's coming. This won't be easy, and it'll get ugly. There will be people who try to discredit you, who will twist the facts to protect Reed. But if you're ready for that, we'll fight." Mariah's resolve solidified in that moment. She had already fought for her country. She had already fought to protect others, and now it was time to fight for herself, and for everyone who had ever been victimized by people like Reed. The next day, the news broke. The video of her encounter with Officer Reed went viral. Social media erupted with opinions, debates, and, most importantly, support. People from all walks of life, strangers, fellow veterans, activists, began speaking out. They had seen the injustice in Reed's actions. They had witnessed his abuse of power, and they weren't going to let it slide. Mariah's phone rang constantly as messages poured in from reporters asking for interviews, wanting to know her side of the story. She kept her cool, knowing that now wasn't the time to get caught up in the media frenzy. She had a purpose, a goal, and nothing was going to distract her from it. Days passed, and the pressure mounted on the department. People were demanding answers. Reed's reputation was in tatters. His fellow officers began to distance themselves from him, realizing that his actions had not only disgraced himself, but also stained the badge he wore. The investigation into his conduct intensified, and his days in uniform were numbered. But for Mariah, the fight wasn't over. She had exposed the system for what it was, and now she had to see it through. She had already won a small victory, but she knew that true change would take time. She wasn't going to let Reed's actions define her. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else stop her from standing up for what was right. In the days that followed, Reed's world began to unravel. The suspension turned into an internal investigation, and the weight of the consequences grew heavier with each passing day. His colleagues, once supportive, now avoided him. The video of his humiliation played on repeat, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Reed sat alone in his apartment, staring at the TV, the news coverage playing in the background. His pride, his career, everything he had worked for, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had always prided himself on being above reproach, but now, as the truth came to light, he realized that he was no different from the people he had spent his life looking down on. It was over. His career, his life as he knew it, was gone. And Mariah? She had won. She had taken back the power he had tried to strip from her, and in doing so, she had shown the world that standing up to injustice wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for dignity. As Mariah walked away from the precinct, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The tension, the anxiety that had been building since the day Reed first stopped her, was finally starting to dissipate. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for something bigger, for justice, for accountability, for every person who had been silenced by the abuse of power. The road ahead was still uncertain, but this victory, no matter how small it seemed, was a sign that change was possible. Reed's career had crumbled. The weight of the consequences was starting to catch up with him. His actions had been exposed for what they truly were, and now the world was seeing him for what he really was. A man who had let his authority corrupt him, who had used his badge to manipulate and control. But Mariah had made sure that wouldn't go unchecked. She had shown him, and everyone watching, that no one was above reproach, not even those who wore the badge. The news had spread. People were talking, and the conversation had shifted. This wasn't just about one cop making a mistake. This was about a system, about the larger picture of power dynamics and accountability. Mariah had done what so many others had failed to do. She had exposed the cracks in that system and shown the world that standing up against injustice, no matter how small the fight, could have an impact. Her phone buzzed as she stepped outside into the evening air, the soft hum of the city wrapping around her. It was a message from her lawyer, a simple note of encouragement. "You did good today. This is just the beginning." She smiled to herself, her resolve hardening. There would be more battles, more challenges to face, but this one, this first one, was hers. She had fought for herself, and in doing so, she had paved the way for others to do the same. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction, and sometimes that was all you needed to ignite real change. If you've ever faced injustice, if you've ever felt like the world was stacked against you, Let Mariah's story be a reminder. No matter the odds, no matter the power standing in your way, standing up for what's right can shift the balance. If her journey resonated with you, if it made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going, because together, we can change the world, one small victory at a time. And if you want to be part of the movement for justice, don't forget to subscribe and stay updated on more stories that challenge the status quo. Your voice matters, and it's time we all started using it.